Right, so we have our welcome to the April edition of the TwinCities.net user group. We're excited to have Lyle Luppes join us today. He's a author and workshop leader. It's a lot of experience, and we're really excited to hear what he has to say about the Dad-O-Matic. Of course, there's a tech stack in there somewhere. So take it away, Lyle.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. It's good to see y'all. Been to this group several times. It's been a little while. Thursdays seem to always be busy here. Anyway, I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on for a while. Not a whole lot of slides I'm going to share today. It's going to be more hands-on. Let's look at some code and get some interesting things. So I've been doing .NET, kind of what we were saying earlier, since before .NET existed, right? Before it actually existed, I was doing VB3 and VB6, and .NET came out, and we had to switch to C Sharp. And so I've been doing this for a lot of years, way too many years. I've always been passionate about technology, learning new things, staying on top of things. I've worked at some of the local firms, GMAC, Residential Funding, and 3M. Worked at some big places like EDS and GM. I've also done small consulting firms and startups. I had my own private firm for a while. Uh, the last 13 years, I was out at 3M before this is my current stint here. Worked out there as a developer, a team lead, a contractor, an employee, an IoT architect up until 2021. And 2020 happened. A lot of people kind of sat back and learned to bake bread and watch TV. And my wife and I were just buried in 2020. I worked in the division of 3M that sold N95 masks. And so we were just swamped that year. Very busy for us. And my wife was working as a manager of a store that sold food and meals. And so she was buried that year. We worked very hard, hardly had any time off, saved our money. And then in the mid June 2021, we both decided we needed a break. And so I quit my job, kept asking my manager if I could have a few months off without pay, and he said no. And so I said, fine, I quit. Um, we resigned our jobs and we took off. This is actually our newer RV. We had an older RV, very similar looking to this, but took off, and that was kind of our map. We just wandered around the country for a year. So in that time, we did about 30,000 miles that year, 33 different states, 18 national parks. So a lot of the photos and backgrounds you'll see as national parks or things that I've done or taken and places we've been. So we did that for a year. Love to travel, love to talk about that stuff. That's always fun. When I came back, I joined Microsoft as a senior cloud architect. So that's what I'm doing now. I've been doing that for almost 3 years now, working as a cloud architect in Microsoft. I see Chris House was online. He and I are peers on the same team, do very similar things. And we work in an area they call app innovation. So it's our position. We work with large manufacturing commercial firms. So people that spend a lot of money on Azure, we get to work with them and help them determine how can they best use those resources, where could they improve, if you want to do an architecture review or figure out what's next. And it feels like the last year on my team, I've done a lot of things. I kind of have a passion, as we'll see, for DevOps and infrastructure as code and automation. And a lot of the things that come up on our team, when something comes up with the Azure DevOps question, my teammates are always pinging me to get me involved. So I've been involved in a lot of those kind of things, spending a lot of time in Azure DevOps, a little bit in GitHub, and doing a lot of that. Last year, I've probably done yeah, or somewhere around 10 different classes with 10 different customers where I've spent a week with a customer teaching them Azure DevOps or automations or pipelines or Bicep or something in that area. So I have a lot of material and a lot of slides I could share. Probably not going to because I don't think that's the most fun thing to do for an hour here. Um, but I'll have some of that kind of stuff. So I was going to take this slide off. Just some of the tools I've worked with when we talk about Azure DevOps. You know, used to be Visual Source Safe and then Team Foundation Server and then VSO and then VSTS and VSTO and then VSTS again and then Azure DevOps. We'll talk about that a little bit. One of the differences, if you see Azure DevOps Service, that's the cloud base, right? That's a SaaS service that Microsoft provides. Azure DevOps Server is the on-prem edition of Azure DevOps. So you can run the same stuff on-prem if you want. It's maybe slightly behind. They put all the new stuff in the cloud-based versions and then do a release every once in a while on the other on-prem server. And then there's GitHub, of course, which Microsoft bought. And the question usually comes up, what's going to happen? And right now we're saying we're supporting both of these and will for the foreseen future. So I think they're both good, viable solutions for DevOps. So this is all about project I called the dad jokes, right? So programmer loses 3 of his fingers in a tragic accident, asks the surgeon, will I still be able to write code like I used to with this hand with only 2 fingers? And you know what the doc says? Yeah, maybe, but I wouldn't count on it, right? Everybody's off mute and off speaker on video. I can't see it.
There we go. So
There we
that's a
go.
big belly laugh for you there.
There you go.
Good stuff.
What do you call a Jedi with anxiety disorder? Anybody know? Yeah, it's the Panic in Skywalker.
Nice, nice.
Where's Mark Halal?
What's worse than a box of snakes? A box that's supposed to be full of snakes.
That's a good one.
That's
That's a good one.
2 more. Chuck Norris recently made a use of a stunt double, but only for the crying part, right? So that was.
Nice.
And then this one came up. I once told a bunch of jokes in a Zoom meeting and nobody laughed. It turns out I'm not even remotely
Oh,
funny.
nice.
Yes.
Very good.
Anyway, I've got about I don't know, there's like 3,000 jokes in this database. So it's all around a joke of, where does a dad store his dad jokes? Well, in a database, of course. And so as I was working on some of these things with clients, I need a good app to show them some of these concepts that we'll talk about. And so I put this together. It's a very simple Blazor web app. And I mean, when I say very simple, I mean, it's simple. This is the interface. How many programmers does it take to change a light bulb? None. It's a hardware problem. And you can click, tell me another one. It'll tell you another joke or another joke. Or you can do a search. And that's like the entire interface, right? So you go out and say, search for cow jokes. Well, did you hear SpaceX launch cows into orbits? It's the herd shot around the world. Shot herd around the world. So that's it. And my point with this was, I want an app where I don't want people to focus on, well, what did you do in Blazor and how does that work? It's very simple. It's 2 pages, 3 pages if you count about, which doesn't do anything. But what I do with this is show all these different concepts. And so we can talk about Bicep infrastructure as code with this. I can talk about YAML pipelines and deploying this in Azure DevOps. Could talk about GitHub Actions because it actually does that too. We could talk about AZD up, and we could talk about Playwright automation testing or integrated security testing. I have that in there too. So all of those different pieces are in this repository. And to tell you what, I'll just drop the link in the chat so you can feel free to go grab this if you want. Let me throw that in there. And actually, there's the link right there. Luppes.com or the Luppes MS is my repo. So if I go out here, that's my GitHub handle, and there's the repo that we're going to be looking at. So when I look at it today, it's like, what do you guys want to look at? Are you more interested in the infrastructure or the pipelines, or does anybody know what AZD up is? Have y'all heard of that? The AZD command line tool? Anybody? Yes, no?
No.
All right. Maybe we'll start with that. I'll show you that. And we'll talk a little bit about the pipelines of Bicep. I think I'll spend more of the time on Playwright because that's what I kind of heard people are interested. I think you've had some presentations on Bicep and YAML, but certainly can divert into any of these other areas if people want to know more about it. We certainly can do that. And I'm going to do mostly live code presentations as opposed to slide decks. I mean, I've got slide decks with hundreds of slides in it. I'll probably show a couple, but not very many. I think it's more interesting to see some code that's out there. So if you were to pull this repo down, it would look like this. This is the in Visual Studio code. I'm showing this. And the way I tend to source my projects, I will have everything in here that you're going to need if you pull this down to do all this stuff. So if you know about GitHub Actions, they have a required, they have to be in a folder called .github workflows. And that's where all my GitHub Actions are to deploy this. Similarly, I've created an ASDO pipelines for Azure DevOps pipelines, for YML pipelines, right? So all those are in the Azure ASDO pipelines. And the Azure folder, the .azure, that's what AZD up will create. I'll show you that in just a moment. Then as you scan down, I've got documentation. And then in the infra folder, that's where all my Bicep is. Bicep, of course, is how do I define a resource in Azure? Infrastructure as code. So this is all my infrastructure that gets deployed. And then node modules comes up because I'm using Playwright. I don't check that into source code, but it's here because I ran Playwright. Playwright is my testing tool, one of the testing tools I use. There's 3 different test tools I can demo here. And then the source is in this database folder. And this is where the Blazor app is at. So it's all set to go and get deployed from here. So AZD, what is AZD? Let's start with that. AZD is the Azure Developer Command Line tool, right? So if you go out and use this, you have to install this. It's a command line tool. And literally with an AZD command, if your project is set up for this appropriately, you go out and type AZD, right? And it'll tell you if you do this, give you a few uh, tips and helps here of things you can do. But one of which you can do if your project is set up for AZD, you can just say AZD up. And you all can pull this code down to your local machine right now and do this exact same thing. And type AZD up. It's going to ask you what name do you want to give this. This name will be used to create all the resources in Azure. So I'm going to call this TCNUG DAD, right? If I do that, it says, great, now I know your environment name. If you haven't logged into your Azure command line before, it's going to ask you to log in. Where did my, I don't see my subscription in here right now. That's weird. Normally I'd see my personal subscription. I was going to demo this, but there it is, 27 Luppes Sandbox. All right, so there's my subscription. It's going out, logging into there, saying what data center you want to deploy to, and I'm going to pick East US 2. And now it's off and running. That's it. In 5 minutes or so, I will have this entire thing out in Azure fully deployed, right? Without having to do anything else. If I show my Azure thing here, I've got, for DAD, I have a couple of these demos that I have, but not the TCNUG DAD resource, which we'll see show up here shortly. So that's what AZD is doing. You can see now it's packaged the web service and it's building the app. It's going to start deploying the Azure resources to my subscription right there. And then once it does all that, it will actually deploy the binaries and we'll have a fully working website with nothing besides just typing AZD up. Very simple. It's great for development tools, for testing, debugging things. If you're going to do something like this, an open source package, you can easily give this to other people and let them deploy it. So you can see there now it's creating this resource group, RGTCNUG DAD. And in fact, there's my resource group that it's creating. If I go into Azure and look at it, it's starting the deploys, deploying all these different things, log analytics, websites, storage accounts, all the things that are needed to run this application. And this will take a few more minutes to finish here. So what did I do to make this work? there's a couple things. This file in the root called Azure YAML. This is the one that you have to define. And it's basically just telling the application my infrastructure is here in this folder, and I want you to start with this Bicep file. And I'm going to use a GitHub pipeline, which really it's not using GitHub, it's just doing that kind of in the background. And this is where my project is, and it's a C# app service. And AZD knows enough about these kind of things to know how it's going to compile that, how it should deploy it to the web service. So there's a few of those. If you go look on that AZD site, it will tell you a little bit about the options it has available. So now it's actually deploying this. It's done with all the Bicep. If we go look at the site again, all of those succeeded. And it's deployed all of these resources for me, an app service, a plan, app insights, log analytics, and storage account. But there's no binary in here, so this isn't going to work yet because it's still deploying this. But in a minute, we should be able to, when this finishes, go to this website and actually have a fully deployed, fully working website with nothing other than typing AZD up. Only thing you got to make sure is whatever name you give this, TCNUG, DAD in my case, doesn't exist because that has to be globally unique, right? So if you put in test, it's probably going to fail because somebody already has something named test and it's not going to work. But that's AZD in a nutshell, right? If you do AZD commands, there's some other ones you can do config and do configurations. When I'm done with this, I did AZD up. I can also do AZD down. And AZD down then would delete this whole thing when I'm done. I don't have to know anything else besides up or down. I could do just the deploy that does just the code. I could just do the package, or the provision does just the Bicep, right? So I can do all of those different pieces. I can create a deployment pipeline if you want. It's a very simple pipeline. It just basically runs an AZD command, but there's a lot of cool things you can do with this. And you'll see a lot of betas. They're working to improve this as they go along. There are ways to put hooks for scripts. If you want to say run a script before or after this happens, you can put those scripts in line here. A lot of options. So questions about AZD up? Does that make sense to everybody?
Do you want people to interrupt and ask questions, or do you want them
Yes.
in the chat? Okay.
Yeah, no, go ahead and interrupt me anytime. I should
All
have
right.
started with that. I love interactive sessions, so anybody that wants to come up and just talk over top of me on the speaker, go ahead and let me know whenever.
I think Maxim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Great. Hey, Lyle. So Bicep is a similar tool as a Terraform or maybe
Yes.
a Pulumi, right?
Yes.
P-U-L-U-M-I. Any principal difference between them, or your personal preference?
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know how much we want. I wasn't planning to cover, I was going to talk about Bicep a little bit, so this is probably a good time. Let me go into what Bicep really is and does. Bicep is an infrastructure as code tool, right? So if you think infrastructure as code, right? That's, you store your code, deploy all your things. And I usually, when I'm doing infrastructure as code, I like VS Code because it's got some nice extensions, right? And the extensions make it so that it understands my Bicep and does type ahead and all those kind of things. But Bicep, it all comes down to knowing what this is. So when you're deploying to Azure, everything in Azure goes through the Azure Resource Manager. Whether you know it or not, if you've deployed to Azure, you've used this. If you go from the portal, from PowerShell, from CLI, whatever it is, you go through Azure Resource Manager. And Azure Resource Manager is going to deploy to one of these 5 levels, either to the tenant management group, subscription resource group, one of those levels. Most people will only really usually see these couple levels down here, but these are more like your company-wide people that own all this stuff are going to do this and set policies up here to control what you can or can't do. I'll get to the Bicep here in a sec. I just want to throw some background really quick. So when you're doing deploys to Azure, you have to have a resource provider. That's a key. And those resource providers are in your subscription. And those you'll see out in your subscription like this. And these are the things that are turned on in your subscription that you can deploy, right? So I can deploy a web app here because that's registered. So this word here, Microsoft.web, is the name of my provider, right? And so if I'm deploying, actually what I have to use is an ARM template, which is JSON. So this is what an ARM template looks like. The JSON has that resource. And whether you're doing Pulumi, whether you're doing Terraform, whether you're doing Bicep, they're all really coming down to this because when you call those APIs,
Right.
it's going to create this template, right?
So it's not, I'm sorry, it's not, so we can use ARM template,
Right.
but at the same time, we can use like Azure CLI commands.
Right.
So
CLI, or yeah, you can do the CLI commands. You can do it from the portal, or they're all really going to do this template in the background. So now what Bicep does, Bicep is like kind of like TypeScript. You know, you do TypeScript and it creates JavaScript in the background. That's what Bicep is doing. When you do Bicep, it's a transpiler that basically takes some human readable language and converts it into that ARM template that then gets used in Azure. Now, when you ask about like, what's the difference with Pulumi or Terraform, those are
maybe just your
tools.
personal feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to use Bicep all the time because it's really more of the native language. So it's a 0-day language where any new features will be supported in Bicep. The main difference I see between Terraform and Bicep is a live comparison, right? So it's a declarative language where you say, in Bicep, you say, this is what I want to happen. So if I was to go look at my storage account, let's say, this is what I want it to be. I want it to have these tags and these properties. And when I try to run this Bicep, it's going to compare what is in my subscription versus this Bicep and try to match those up and make them the same, right? There's nothing else in between those two. If I do Terraform, Terraform has a state file out there that says, this is what I think is in Azure. And I'm going to look at my Terraform versus what's in the state file and try to make the changes based on that, right? So it's kind of got an interpreter in the middle, whereas Bicep is just directly, I run it, I compare what's in my Bicep to what's in my subscription. I like that approach. And it's, like I say, it's native, so it's always up to date. Couple of things you got to watch for that. Let's see. We'll talk about here in Bicep. This is basically the format in Bicep. When you're doing it, you say what you're going to deploy. This is that resource provider. And then you give it, this is my API. What version am I going to use? And then everything you deploy has these two fields, the name and location. And then all of this stuff is all variable based on what you're deploying, right?
I will write the name.
This name is the actual name of the resource.
Yeah.
This one here is like a pseudonym inside my Bicep that I can call it, which I can show. But that's how Bicep works. And then there's actually a what if mode, which is nice.
Right.
Right. So if I want to run this Bicep and say, if I were to run this Bicep file, it's going to do that compare this Bicep against what's in my subscription. It's going to tell me exactly these are the differences between them, right? That's very important. Most of the time, the default is this incremental mode. So if I'm running Bicep, it just deploys the changes, whatever properties it sees that are different, it does that. You do have to be careful. Some people want to use this complete mode, which is great. But if you do complete mode, if there's anything in your subscription or resource group that is not in the Bicep file you're deploying, it'll delete it. Right? So you have to be careful about that. Make sure if you're doing complete that you do a what if command. So that's what I could get into a lot of Bicep and what it is and how it works and tips and tricks. I don't know if we want to do that versus going into more like the Playwright stuff. I kind of heard Playwright was more where we were aiming, so I was
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
giving
Thank you
kind
so
of a
much.
quick,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. But we can do more on this at some other time if you want, or I could come back and do more of that. Because there's a lot of things in doing this Bicep. So on my Bicep, you'll see starts with this main Bicep file. This is where I call different modules that say I want to do this and this and this and this. That's how I install all those pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Now
One last question about Bicep. Can we export Bicep template from Azure, like in a similar way as ARM template?
absolutely. Show you an example of that. So let's see if this came back up and is working. So this should be the
Up
things
and
I
running.
just deployed. And there's the working TCNUG DAD database, right? So that's
Cool.
fully deployed. So now if you wanted to see, like for instance, this one right here, what is the ARM template or what is the the Bicep, excuse me. The quickest way to do that is I go over here to JSON view
Mm-hmm.
and I grab this resource ID. This is a big long string that defines this specific thing in Azure, right? So if I copy that, so now I have that in my clipboard. If I want to create my own Bicep, right? So if I name this demo Bicep, so now over here, this is an empty Bicep file.
Mm-hmm.
If I hit F1 to get the command palette and I say insert resource, and I have these Bicep commands because I've installed the Bicep extension.
Uh-huh.
I say insert a resource, and I put in that big long string, hit enter. About 2 seconds later, it should give me all the Bicep for that resource.
Oh,
Simple as that.
uh-huh. It goes to Azure and grabs all
Yep.
definitions.
Yep. And if I was to, yeah, I can actually, since I have that installed, I can convert this to an ARM template,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it'll actually go create an ARM template right here, demo JSON. There's the ARM template.
Uh-huh. Wow.
You also have, here's another trick. If you have an empty file here, let's say this demo Bicep is empty.
Uh-huh.
If I grab an ARM template, copy it, watch very closely, I'll paste it. You'll see JSON for just a second. 3, 2, 1, paste. And then it disappears. Now it's Bicep.
Wow.
So the extension knew this is a Bicep file, but you pasted in an ARM template. And it knows it's ARM because this line up at the top says this is a deployment template, right? So it just converts it for me. So there's a lot of cool things the Bicep extension does here. You can also, with that extension, do a visualizer, right? And have it show you, here's all the different things that were in that template, and look at the visualizing here and see what all the different pieces and how they relate to each other.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So there's a few nice things. And the type ahead stuff is great in Bicep. If I was to change the name here, let's get that. You'll see it turned red because if I hover over it, couldn't find this file, right? So it has all those things. If I if I had the wrong parameters and I hover over that, it's like that's not a valid parameter for this file. So it's doing checking and type ahead, things like that. If I didn't include the parameters, in this case, these are probably not required. If I made them required by not giving a default. So if I said that one is required because it has no default, when I go back here, now you'll see you're missing a required property, right? So it knows this is required. You have to supply it. And I could actually do the type ahead and just say add the required properties. So there's a lot of really slick things in the Bicep extension in VS Code for this. All right, so I could supply that parameter and now I'd be all set to go.
Cool.
So that's some Bicep the quickest one, like you said, the import is really nice. Being able to do that, that's just going up to the command line, type bicep, and you'll see all these different commands that are available.
Mm-hmm.
You can do all these from here, or you can right click on the file and see most of them over here too. Right, I can actually, if I want, deploy this bicep and it'll walk me through just like AZD did. What subscription, where do you want to put it?
Mm-hmm.
I tend to not recommend that because I want people to use pipelines and automation. Because if you deploy it, I can't repeat it later. I don't know what you did.
Uh-huh. Do I need some to run a Bicep? Do I need a Node.js or Docker instance?
No, it should be just the command. So there's actually a AZ bicep command.
Uh-huh.
When you install the AZ bicep utility, then it has all those commands. AZ
Mm-hmm.
bicep help, right? So once you install that bicep utility, and that might get installed when you do the extension, I forget. Otherwise, you have to install this bicep CLI tool.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. So it will be
That's all you
globally
need.
available.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
Should
Thanks
be
so
it.
much.
Yeah. So that's bicep. We've touched on that. We've touched on AZD. So I've done the AZD deploy. We've watched that go up and down. Deployed a whole application here a few minutes. In a very similar way, if I was to deploy these with these pipelines, I could call this infra web app pipeline, which most of the details is in this one right here, right? And this pipeline, in this case, infra web app pipe, does these different actions, right? Of first, I'm going to do a scan, and it does the scan by calling this scan template. And then it does a build, and then it does create infrastructure, then it does deploy, then it does the testing. The testing is where we'll come back to with Playwright, right? And what that looks like in real life is something like this. This is a run that I did of this earlier, where all of those different pieces that I was referencing, right? So there's the scan application shows up here as scan application, then there's the build. So each of these different stages shows up in this is Azure DevOps pipeline runner, right? So I can see I've done these things where it's done this code scan, it built the app, deployed the bicep, it deployed the binaries into the resources, and then I ran a Playwright smoke test. So that's how you can define all these in YAML and have that in there. So this is all, if someone were you pull down this code, you can see here's the exact things that I did to deploy this app, right? And I have a README file in here that says here's what the pipelines do, what all the different steps are, how you'd set it all up if you wanted to go through and set up all the different pieces you'd need to do, including I'm using one variable group with some things. So that's the Azure DevOps pipelines. GitHub Actions are the exact same way, right? I could go to the GitHub Actions workflow README and see, here's my, close a couple of these. Here's my GitHub Actions that are out there and what they do and how you set up your credentials and the secrets to get your actions and pipelines both need to have the proper credentials to be able to talk to your Azure subscription and push things out there. Right, so that's where you'll set all those up. Those are all defined in here. So without going more into pipelines, I think we'll stop there unless somebody wants to do more of that, but we certainly could talk about that. But I think I'm going to focus on Playwright, given that that's what some people had asked about. But all these things are out here in all the pipelines for publishing and including the testing stuff that I just showed you. We'll talk about how that works.
Lyle, can
Yeah.
you post the URL for the GitHub
Oh,
in
I
the chat,
forgot to do
please?
that, didn't I? I started to do that and then didn't find the chat button. Where is my chat?
Well, you know you're doing well when people still ask for it, so
That's good. Yeah, sorry. There's the
thank
link
you.
for that one. I will also post two more here. In fact, I'll just post all three of these right now. So the database website is what I'm going through the most right now. The Playwright course materials I'll be going through in a few minutes. So this is one, like I said, a lot of times the stuff I'm doing here, I'm doing this as a full day presentation in class with companies, talking about how to use Playwright. So we'll go through a lot of that. And then YAML and Bicep class, if you go into that link, that one has a lot of this same stuff where I'm talking about YAML and Bicep, how to use those, and then there's some labs. So if you wanted to learn more about how to do YAML or Bicep, you could go into these labs and it'll walk through how do you create a Bicep, how do you create a YAML pipeline, how do you run it, how do you build the stages. I go into a lot of details there. Maybe not the first thing I would say if you're going to start doing this. I'd probably go down somewhere in here. I have these other Microsoft Learn paths that I'd probably recommend if you're going to start. But these have a lot of good informations and also a lot of good examples. Like in the YAML, the very last lab that I have has all of my sample pipelines. When I talk to people about how would you do a YAML pipeline that does, and I have a whole bunch of examples here. One that does scanning, one that does a build and deploy, one that does what if I want to kick one off when I do a pull request and have a scan and build as part of a pull request. This talks about that. Dependencies. This one compiles a command line into a single file executable. So compiles a console app, builds an executable, then pulls a certificate out of a key vault and signs the executable. And I think this one also in the key vault does some things with my key vault's behind a firewall, so it dynamically adds the IP address of the agent running the build into the firewall, gets the certificate, and then removes the firewall rule. So there's a lot of pieces in here, fairly complex examples that I keep out here. So when people ask me, how do you do that? I've got some examples to show them on some of these things. So those three are all in the chat now. And the one we're doing the most, or starting with today, is just this database one, right? So, all right. So this last piece here, you'll see I ran two tests, a UI test and an API test. I said there were a couple ways to do the testing. And I have three different test options here for you. We just deployed this new site, the TCNUG AZD Azure Websites.net. If you want to test something locally, I'm sure many people have probably used Postman before. I don't know how many of you have used the REST client that's out there for Visual Studio Code. It is a third-party, I think it's still a third-party extension. They might have built-in support in the latest versions, but I think the older ones you had to install the REST client in the extensions. Let's see, extensions by this guy, Ochamo. So this REST client for Visual Studio, if you install this, it basically gives you that functionality just like Postman would do, right? So here's a file, and I've defined this is my URL. So I'm going to paste in that new site that we just did, /API, right? So that's my base. There's an API key here that got deployed as part of the Bicep, dad jokes, bang. And now you'll see if I hover over where it says send request, that becomes a hot link. I'm going to say I want to get a joke. So that's my API/joke. If I click on request, it just ran it, and there's my result, right? Kind of just like Postman would do, only I don't have to have Postman. I just run it all here, and I can include this test as part of my source code. Or say I want to have, what are all the chicken jokes, right? Or let's say Chuck Norris jokes. I can click on that. I must not have that spelled right. Let's do that category. There's another one to give me a list of categories, but there's all the categories, all the jokes in one category, right? So this is a cool tool if you haven't seen it before, .http file using the REST client. So that's one of the first ones I'll do when I'm testing. You can also change this to be, localhost. Whatever that is you're developing, and you can run these tests locally and make sure everything works while you're testing. So this is kind of an API tester. That's one step. Step two is unit tests, right? We're all familiar with those. So I've got some unit tests in here. I've got some API tests for the same thing. Go out, set up a mock, go call a list to see if the list works, get a random joke, same arrange act assert as you would normally see, right? So I've got unit tests. I can run them locally in VS Code, or I can run them in my pipeline. So in the pipeline, during my build process, restore build, here's where I go in and say, I want to restore the tests, and then I do a .NET core, so it's doing a .NET test, right? And then I'm telling it, because I'm doing this in a pipeline, I want you to log it in a specific format in a specific place, because I'm going to publish those results. And if I do this right in my pipeline, then when I go to my pipeline results over here, up at the top here, you'll see a tests tab. And you can see here's all my tests. I'm going to include the past tests, right? And now I see there's my unit tests that I had. They show up in here. I can see my unit tests ran, they all passed, and I can see my code coverage, right? So I've got a code coverage, which I think was the very last thing I did in this pipeline, is create a code coverage report using the Cortuba, I can't remember how you say that, Cortuba report generator and code coverage tool, right? There it is, the report generator. Anyway, shows up here, there's all my code coverage, right? So that's all built into my pipeline, runs those tests, shows up here. That's a unit test. Then the third kind of test I do in here is Playwright tests, which are more of a smoke test or user interface test, right? So in this case, I told it after I've deployed my app, I want you to go out to the app, find this page, make sure you can find this page and find this page. I want you to call these APIs and make sure this actually returns properly. So let's talk about what Playwright is and how that works. So that shows up here, and it also shows up in here. I can see my Playwright results, right? So those UI tests, if I was to pop that open, I'm going to open that. Gives it just a sec to download. When I open it, it should show me my results, my test, just like I would see if I ran it locally. And it's taking a minute. All right, never mind. We'll come back to that. But that's all built into the pipeline to save those artifacts. So let's talk about what Playwright is. That's kind of where we were headed on this. I'm just going to bring open, hey, there's my Playwright results, finally showed up. Did the 2 tests. And if I click on each of those, I can see all the details from the tests. I can see the output generated by the test, so I can see all those different pieces. Let's go back to Playwright. And I'm just going to, I hate it when people do PowerPoints and just click through the slides like this, but since I'm kind of skimming through it real quick, I'm just going to do it this way. So Playwright is an end-to-end tool for modern web app. Works on any browser, any platform. And the key part is it's a singular API, right? So you write it once, run it everywhere. Isolated, fast execution, all those kind of things. And when I talk about who's using it, most of the teams at Microsoft that have web front ends are using this tool, right? So Microsoft built this as an open source utility, and we use it to test all these things. So it's probably going to work for your web app if it works for all these web apps, right? There's a lot of flexibility in this tool. Open source and free, no charge for any of this. The only place there is a charge, if you wanted to do load testing at scale, we do have a service that you can, just like anything else in Azure, you can scale that up and pay for that service. If you want to say, I want to run 10,000 tests at once, you could run that on your own server. It might take a very long time, or you can run it on the Playwright service and pay for it. So otherwise, if you just run the tests on your own thing, it's totally free, doesn't cost you anything. It has 4 different languages it supports. Primarily, you see most things I see are TypeScript, JavaScript. Some people do in .NET. I've got examples of both for you. Skip through some of these features about how it's all awesome. You can set up full debugging, right? And set breakpoints just like you do in your code. If you're using VS Code, you can set a breakpoint, stop at any of these. You can do screenshots, videos, logs, all those kind of things set up inside here. Supports lots of browsers. This is one of the difference. You'll hear people talk about, I've used Selenium. It's a little faster than Selenium because one of the differences in architecture, Selenium goes out and opens a web request for each different thing that it tests, whereas Playwright just opens a web socket and uses one socket to connect everything through. So it does work quite a bit faster the way it's architected. I don't know if it's a huge deal, but it might be. This is a eye chart. You can go out and see this on Playwright's website. Feel free to look at it. We'll talk about most of these things as we go along. So there's a VS Code extension for this, right? So you can install, run, debug all your tests from VS Code, or you can do it at the command line. So I'm going to drop back to code here for a bit and show you how this works. So in the mantra of nothing up my sleeve here, this directory is empty, right? So we've got nothing going. And I'll zoom it in a little bit. .NET new web app, right? If I do that, it's going to build me a nice, simple little web app. Not much to it. So I've got a few things in here now. And then I'm going to install Playwright. npm init Playwright. I can type at latest. So Playwright is built with Node, right? So it's using npm to go install this package. It's going to ask me a couple questions. I'm just going to hit the defaults on all of them for the moment, just to let it go. So now it's off, installing all those Node modules, trying to get all the pieces in place for it to run Playwright. It takes about 2 or 3 minutes. The longest part is usually getting the browser stuff. That was pretty quick, actually. Once it's done, it's going to give me back this little sample thing saying this succeeded, hopefully, if you're doing this and have all this stuff right. If we want to run a test, it basically starts off with the defaults. I quite literally can run Playwright tests, and it's going to go run the first set of default tests for me, right? And like I said, I'm doing this all at the command line, just as a way, because this helps understand, I think, how it works. I could do it all in Visual Studio Code, but you wouldn't quite understand what it's doing as much. So you can see here it ran 6 tests. You used 4 workers, and the workers are based on, I've got 2 CPUs or 2 cores in my machine, so 2 workers per core, I think. And the 6 tests, I'll show you where that comes into play in just a moment. If I want to see a report of what just happened, I can just run this. It's going to open its own little web browser and then serve me up the report that it just created to say, there's the test that it ran, right? So it ran has title and get started 3 different times, one for Chromium, one for Firefox, and one for WebKit, right? So I talked about it's one API for all the different browsers. So this is where it's running at 3 different times. If I was to go back to this, I'm going to break that server so I can get back to command line. And I'll just open up Visual Studio Code and show you what it generated for me. Right. So there's the website is the wroot and all that program. But what Playwright generated for me, if you go look in node modules, you'll see a Playwright directory. So it installed those modules here. The report, Playwright report, is what it created when I ran the test. The test results were also created when I ran that. So it's got some formatting of how it reports those tests for you. So you could use that in a pipeline or some other tool. But this is where the tests are actually defined, right? So there's the two. If you remember, we saw the has title and get started link. These are the tests that it gives you as a sample. Now, if you've done any kind of JavaScript or web dev before, you probably can read this in very quickly and see, oh, okay, here's it has the title, and I'm going to go to this page with this URL. I'm going to expect that that page has a title with this, right? That all makes perfect sense. You can do things like this, go to the page. This get by role is where I'm saying I want to find the first link with this name and then click it, right? So it's fairly intuitive to someone who's done any kind of JavaScript coding. This stuff all makes sense. It just kind of works. And if you
Can
have all
we,
the, go ahead.
yeah, can we control how those tests run simultaneously or one by one?
Oh yeah. Yeah. There's options for all that in here, parallel or in sequence or yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of good options for that.
Mhm.
We'll get to it. So I've got all
Can
the
we
type
generate
ahead.
can
Go
we
ahead.
generate same initial spec file for .NET?
It won't generate the file for .NET for you. I'll show you a .NET example in a little bit. This is like the base sample. I don't
Uh-huh.
think it does. I've not done much with the .NET one, to be honest. I've got some examples. I've, got it to run and work, but mostly I just use the TypeScript if I'm doing web dev.
Mhm.
So most of this, you're gonna, when you're doing web tests, you're gonna be getting something and then performing some action. So it's got all these different gets. You can get by attribute, by label, by role. The role is like a button or a link or something. You can do that by test ID. So if you've done a lot of testing with like Selenium, you've had to put IDs on all your HTML elements. So if you want to say get by ID, you can put that here and give an ID, give a text, give a title. So you do a locator to find something. And then once you've found it, like here, now you can do some actions on it. Like I want to click it, or I want to clear it, or I want to see, is it checked or is it whatever? So you have a bunch of actions here, set focus. So once again, fairly straightforward, especially if you're using a tool like this that has the type ahead. I can just hit the period and it shows me all the different options I have for that particular command. So those are the two tests we had, right? The title and the get started. But if you recall back when we were here, we had 6 tests ran, right? So that was the 3 browsers. So in the config file, this Playwright config TS, this is the one that controls all the different things, how the tests work. And you'd asked about things like, can we run these in parallel? You can turn that on or off in the config. And there's a bunch of settings for that of how many workers do you want? How many parallel things do you want? A lot of details out in the Playwright config sections. But this is the default setting, which it generated for me that says I'm going to have 3. These are the projects for the browsers. Essentially, what browsers do I want to run this on? And they said Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit. So if I was going to say, don't care about Firefox, comment that out, delete it, whatever. If I did that, went back here and ran these tests again, now you'll see it's going to run 4 tests on 4 workers because it only has 2 browsers and 2 tests that it's running, right? So that's how you control what is done here.
Does it have Google Chrome or Chromium, WebKit, and Firefox browsers as a binaries?
It's not
NPM
binaries.
package?
I'm not sure exactly how it supports it. I mean, I know it had like that list of browsers it supports back here somewhere. Where'd that page go? I'm not sure how it actually does it, but it shows that it supports these different browsers. So Edge, Chrome, Chromium, Firefox, WebKit. I think there might be more too. There's probably a link here where you could go out and see the browsers. I don't know, but it's all built on Node, so you could probably drill into the node and find it in here if you wanted to. So that's like the default. So what I'm going to do is flip over to, if you were to clone that repo that I posted in chat, what I called the Playwright course materials. Let's see if I can pull that up. I'll pull it up in VS Code. What I've done is taken a lot of these different things that I talk about in the course, and the course will go into a lot more detail, which given that we only have 20 minutes or so left, I won't get into, but I'll usually cover a lot of things like how do you select things, right? So we'll get into selectors, configurations, how do you emulate different things? You can emulate, you can emulate different browsers, different time zones, different, screen sizes. You can do mocking, and you can mock networks. You can mock APIs. You can go in and, say if this API gets called, I want you to replace the return contents with this, so you can do mocking, a lot of that. So what I've got in this course materials link, these are all my examples when I go through in a class, all the different examples that are out there. So I have examples, if I get into like the test examples, this one is a little more thorough example than just those two things, right? So it actually has several different things for going. This is like a typical to-do app that's out there. And in this case, Demo Playwright, they have their own to-do app out there, so you can do all these different tests. There's also a full set in here in the web folder, and this is where it gets more interesting. This one goes after a website. Trying to remember what the URL is, where that's at. Sauce Demo. So if you've ever seen the website called Sauce Demo, it's one that you can use for automated testing examples, right? So I log in, it tells me here's my ID and password. I can log in, and then I can say add this to a cart. And then in my cart, I can say I want to check out and check. So it's all simulated, just a simple shopping app, right? But these tests are all built around that. So one of the big concepts in Playwright, in addition to that thing we were talking about of being able to do locators and things like that, they have what they call page fixtures. So I would create, in this case, like a login page fixture. Think of it like a class that I've written that essentially encapsulates my page as it's designed, right? So my page, I want to be able to enter a username or enter a password or click the button, or I might just have a login method where it does all three of those things for my users, right? For my test cases. So if someone wants to write a test case for the shopping cart, they can just include this encapsulated login page and say, call the login page, log in with this user ID and password, and they're done, right? And that way it keeps your tests, these UI tests, from becoming brittle. The worst problem with writing UI test cases is they break all the time, right? They're always breaking because somebody changes something on a page and all my tests break. If you do it this way, whoever owns this page, if they make a change to it, they should change the test. And then everything else should just use this and it should work, right? It makes your tests a lot more stable and repeatable. So that's called a page fixture. So design this by extending a base page and you add all your fields in there. And these fields have those same things that we were looking at. Go get something by, in this case, they're using an ID. And so it knows where these things are at and it can use them. The cart page has a similar function, so I've got a whole bunch of things on this page. I go find all the elements on the page, and then my test could be as simple as this. Checkout is go click the button, go enter your name, go enter your postal code, finish the checkout, and then go look to see that it went to this checkout complete page. Right? So that's a whole test for doing a checkout once things are in your cart. So some interesting examples out here in the web pages and fixtures. Without enough time to go into a lot of detail, that's how you'd set these up. In a similar way, you can call APIs, right? And the APIs in the test API folder. Very similar, except you'll see this in the middle here where it says request.post. So that's an API post call. And then if I scan down here, here's an API put call, right? So I can create those things, call an API, and then when I get back from that API, I can do these expectations. I expect it to be okay in a 200 result. And then I'm going to look at the body and see if the body contains the things that I want it to contain, right? So you can write an API test in Playwright very easily to do your get, put, post, delete, all those different things. And there's examples here of all that. So that's kind of in a high level what the API does versus a website.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So does each test run in a new session, or it's
Yeah.
working as a bulk?
Yep. I know where you're going. Yep. In the what you normally do on here, I haven't talked about it, but in the let me open up the web config. So there's this concept in here also of a startup and a storage state, right? So in this case, I've got a setup task. So this is going to run a setup task with this test. And that's out here under auth setup. This is the one that goes out and does my login. Right? So the very first time I said, this is a setup task. I want you to go do this login. And then in this case, I'm going to save the cookies into a storage state file in my browser instance. Right? And then every other test that runs, I go back here, I have a dependency on that setup. So it knows this setup is going to, somebody's going to have done the login. And I've stored it here in this standard user auth file. So now my tests run, I can just use those cookies and do my 100 tests without having to log in 100 times. Right.
So it's like a single session per whole bunch of tests.
Right. Right. And this has some stuff in here for, I think in the auth it has a, they call it a standard user and a visual user, which is like an admin level user, right? So we've got two different cookies sets based if you're a standard or an admin, right? So it's got some things like that set up in these tests. And that's all controlled by this setup. Now there are tests here. Trying to remember if any of these have them defined in the pages. You can also have a constructor and have things done inside this test. And there's also a way to set pieces of your test to say, I want a before and an after, right? So I can set it up to have certain actions run before and after my tests run. So I just don't remember if there's an example of that in here. But I know I can do that and set those up, or you can define it in your config to say this is just a dependency. So anytime this browser runs, run this thing first.
Can we generate page level tests or the page definition by scraping any web page?
Yeah, you can actually. If I'm in Visual Studio Code, In this case, I clicked on the test icon. It knows because of my config that's active. Here's the test that's active for here. I can also, if I want, let me just create a new file out here. And I'll put it in my tests. Call it test TS. I can actually go record new, right? And so if I was to go out and say record, and it should open up a browser for me. No Playwright test found. I must have something not quite right. Typically, I would do this and I would say record. You can go, it'll turn on a recorder. You go to the website, it'll record all that code and give you back something that looks like this. You know, you went to this page, you clicked on this thing. May not be perfect, but it does a pretty good job of recording the actions that you did and what you clicked on. So I don't know why it's missing that. Probably because my config file is red at the moment. I'm not
Does
sure
it generate
why.
multiple files while we go from page to page?
I think the recorder will put them all in one function here if you went from page to page, right? So wouldn't be multiple files, it'd just be one test script that you generated. So you see, I've got a whole bunch of configs. And the whole idea in this is as you switch between these different things, if you're doing web tests, one of these setups here is where are my tests, my test directory, you know, right here. So I have web tests in here, I have API tests in here. And then if I'm doing a CI/CD run, I might have some different parameters. Or if I'm calling the Playwright service, I have different parameters. So I just had all these different examples in here. And then I'll show you where I do it in a pipeline to kind of tie this all back together. So in the pipeline, I have these examples up here, very simple pipeline, which just says, I'm going to hard code all these pieces. And if you look at this, it's just like we did on the command line. I need to have node. I need to have NPM. I do an install of Playwright. And then I run npx playwright test, right? This is the very simplest of anything. And then I report the test results because I want to use JUnit and publish that artifact so I can look at it. So that's a pipeline that does the test that we just ran. You could get much more in depth. Some of these other ones, I could do like a scheduled pipeline. I can integrate it in like I did with my dad joke as part of my build, right? And I usually end up coming up with this pipeline Playwright template, which is generic, right? So this template can then be reused in all my other pipelines by just saying, in this case, I want to scan, I want to build, I want to create, then I want to run these tests. In this case, I'm saying I want to run a web test. If I wanted to do an API test, it'd be as simple as saying, now I want to run the API test, and I could run them both. Right?
We're gonna pause here pretty soon so we can do our giveaway.
Okay.
For folks often start dropping off around 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
So we'll pause
I'll stop the live stream
questions.
and recording, and then we'll be back.